Hey everybody, I've had something that really inspired me the other day and I've wanted to write about it, and it's just been tumbling around in my head. And the thing is that there's really too much for me to sit down and write about. I could, but it would take a very long time. So I thought that I would just make a video instead and try to present my thoughts. And now I'm at a little bit of a deficit here because I'm doing this in an unexpected place and time. I happen to be in a spot where I can make this video right now, but I don't have my Bible with me. And this is concerning some scriptures. So without having my Bible with me, I've gone on to the Bible app on the phone, and I just kind of made myself some notes. And so I'll be going off of those. But I apologize that I don't actually have the Word of God right here in front of me. So what I wanted to talk about was how the other day I was reading in Matthew chapter 5, which is the first portion of the Sermon on the Mount, which is where Jesus, at the beginning of his ministry, he goes up onto a hill and there's crowds of people that follow him up there, and he preaches this very lengthy sermon. And Matthew does a wonderful job of writing out the things that Jesus said. But what struck me was reading the history going up to that. It's such a familiar narrative. It's a narrative that I've heard all my life. And so in a way, it's easy to skip through the narrative and not really think about it critically and to not realize exactly what's happening in that narrative. So this time as I read through it, I got more of a view of Jesus being the young man, single. His life is moving forward. He's left his hometown. He's living in Capernaum. So I was getting much more of this view of kind of Jesus the man, and Jesus the man who lives through life decisions that we have to live through, going to a different city and finding a place to live. He goes and he finds disciples and asks them to follow him. He really probably didn't know people in this city until he arrived. Or maybe he did, but it certainly wasn't his home territory. So he was a man living just as we were living in many, many ways. So in that context, he begins to reach out to the people and he begins his ministry. He goes and he's healing people. Many people throughout the region are being healed. People start to flock and come together to him. He starts drawing a crowd. And he's reaching out to his people, to the children of Israel, to the Jews, to the Israelites. And as he's reaching out to them, he's reaching out to a people who were living under the law of Moses. And in fact, the ruling religious faction was the Pharisees. There were other religious factions that were also very, very influential as well. But the Pharisees, from what I can tell, seem to have been the most influential sect of the time. And the culture of the Pharisees focused on following the law so precisely that you actually lived much more strictly than the law required. And the idea was that if you lived even more strictly than what was required by the law, then you would never break the law itself. So in this context, where he's talking to a culture of people who are bound by the law, and it was a law that had been given to them by God, so they were following the law of God, but they were also following many other rules that were in addition to that original law. Within that context, Jesus makes some very critical points. So one thing I realized was that the purpose of the Sermon on the Mount, which I have always read as a whole bunch of sort of rules or admonishments for Christians. He wasn't talking to Christians. He was talking to Jews. And in the Christian church, we need to be accurate about this. Now, it doesn't mean that these things don't apply to Christians, but we need to know the context in order to fully understand what is going on here. If we read these statements that he makes as if he was making them to Christians, then they come across as a new set of rules that we have to abide by. That's not what he was saying. Jesus was saying, you all have been living under this law, and I want to present to you a totally, radically different way to think of how you should be relating to your Creator God, Yahweh, Elohim, and what it means to truly serve God. So, I'm going to say this, and maybe my statement is not going to be 100% accurate. I haven't exactly done some deep theological study on this purpose statement, but how it strikes me is that the purpose of the Sermon on the Mount, what Jesus was doing, was he was establishing a kingdom of relationship rather than religion. He was showing them that the kingdom of God, the true meaning of serving God, was not about the law. It was about your heart and its condition, and what are you going to do to follow your Creator to the utmost. Now, there's going to be a lot of people who say, but the law was given by God, and it was. Now, Jesus is going to address this. First of all, though, before I get to that, I want to mention how he talks about a city on a hill. He says to Israel, you're a city on a hill, and that a city that is set up high on a hill cannot be hidden. It shines light everywhere around it. What he's saying there is, Israel, because of your ancestor Abraham, to whom was made a promise, your entire nation has been preserved, has been selected to be the nation through which Messiah would come, through which truth would be preserved, through which truth would be presented to the rest of the world. He was saying that you have been preserved as a nation, as a people, as an ethnicity. You've been preserved together to provide a path for Yahweh to present his truth to all nations. This truth was not just for Israel. It was for all nations, and Israel was that light on the hill. Now, we as Christians, we tend to take that verse and we apply it to ourselves. And we think, again, like Jesus was talking to Christians at this point. Oh, well, don't you know, Christians sitting in church singing songs with me, you're a city set on a hill. You need to go be a light. Now, that is true. In principle, it is absolutely true. So I'm not saying that that doesn't apply to Christians. But again, the original context is a context of Jesus speaking to a nation that was governed by a religious law that had been given by God, but they had taken this law and they had made the law so big compared to their heart relationship with their Creator that the law was getting in the way. And he was saying, look, this is about serving God, not about serving a rule book. So let's get into this. So then he says, and I'm sorry, I have my notes here, so I'm gonna read some. He says, I have not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. I'm paraphrasing, I'm leaving out a few phrases here and there. Those of you who know the verse by heart, I'm sorry that I'm not quoting it exactly, but here's basically what he says. I have not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. Not one jot or tittle shall pass from the law till all be fulfilled. So, a jot and a tittle, let's say that that's like saying not a single dot over an I and not a single T or a cross on a T will be erased from the law until it all be fulfilled. But immediately before making that statement, he says, I have not come to destroy the law. Everyone says, yay, great. So the law wasn't being destroyed, but to fulfill it. Not one dot over an I, not one slash crossing a T will be removed from the law, or will go away from it, or will be destroyed, or will pass away until the entire law be fulfilled. Now, what we know is that Jesus never sinned, and Jesus fulfilled the law. The law was fulfilled. So, what we have here is Jesus saying, Your relationship with your Creator is not about this set of rules. Your relationship with your Creator is about your relationship with your Creator. These rules are a way for you to approach Him and a way for you to understand Him. But there is coming a time when this law will be fulfilled. And when this law is fulfilled, that is when the law no longer has to take preeminence. The time of following the law all the way to every jot and every tittle will pass when it has been fulfilled, and I will fulfill it. So we have that. And I know those are controversial statements, and I know I'm going to have people coming back on me to argue that point and to say that the law is still in effect and we must follow Torah and a lot of different things. So be it. That's what Jesus said, so take it up with Him. Now, it's interesting because then in verse 19, He says, whoever shall break one of these least commandments shall be called least in the kingdom. Whosoever shall do and teach them shall be called great. So what are the least of these commandments? We know from elsewhere that the entirety of the law is one law. It has like 635 or somewhere around there different statements made within the law, but it is only one law. James says in his writings that if you break one piece of the law, you've broken the entire thing. You've violated the entire law. There is only one law. Okay? So what's he talking about when Jesus says, whoever shall break one of these least commandments shall be called least in the kingdom, and whosoever shall do and teach them shall be called great. What is the least of these commandments? Why is there a least and why is there a greater? And then he says in verse 20, that our righteousness must exceed or surpass that of the Pharisees and the scribes in order for us to even get into heaven. We actually have to have righteousness that is, we have to be better. We have to have more righteousness than the ruling religious people of the day who followed the law exactly. We have to be better than that in order to get to heaven. So what is this all about? Now, as I read on through chapter 5, this is what I realized. This is where we get into this list of rules that, for me, all my life, when I have read these scriptures and when I've heard these scriptures presented, and when Christians get into conversation with each other, and we're usually having a potluck or something, and we get talking about all of these different things, and people say, well, you know, Jesus said that if any man looks after a woman to lust after her, that he's committing adultery in his heart. There's a rule. There's a rule. Or if any man is angry at his brother, it's like he's committing murder already in his heart. That's a rule. Don't get angry. Don't lust. Here's these sets of rules that Jesus gave us. Here's what Jesus was saying. He was saying, the law says thou shalt not murder. And in reality, if you are harboring anger and hatred towards a brother, that you are committing sin in your heart. And it's the same as committing the sin of murder. Why is murder a sin? Murder is a sin not because someone dies. It's because someone hates. That is why murder is a sin. Someone can die as a result of justice, and that's not murder. Someone can die as a result of war, and that can have a lot of discussion about it. Some people would say that that's murder, but an argument could be made that actions of state are not necessarily murder. So the point is, what Jesus is saying is that the law says thou shalt not kill. But if you have a heart relationship with God, you will realize that being angry at your brother offends your Creator. He says that if you say to your brother, Raka, and I don't know exactly what all that means. My understanding is that it was an ancient term that was kind of a derogatory term that was slung towards someone. But that if you said that you could be taken to court. Now, it's a legal issue again. You see what's happening here? This is the law. Whereas if you say to your brother, thou fool, if you have a heart that is critical, if you have a heart that is bitter towards people, you're committing a sin. You're missing the point of what your Creator wants you to live like. So again, we have the law. Oh, don't say raka. That's a legal issue, and you can go to court for that. But it's okay to say thou fool because the law doesn't touch that. No, Jesus is saying, pay attention to what the Creator wants. Pay attention to His heart. The law is just a window to understanding the Creator's heart. The law is not the entirety of His heart. He says, make peace with your brothers before you bring your gifts and your sacrifices. So in that culture, they would bring gifts to the temple. And they would leave these gifts, and they would bring sacrifices. They would leave those sacrifices, and that was a way that they were justified, and that they dealt with the wrongdoings and the imperfections that had occurred in their lives. But Jesus is saying, wait, your gift is basically not even valuable. If you have not gone and made peace with a brother, if you have not gone and done what is right to set the relationship between you and a brother right, then the gift is of no value. Leave the gift and go make things right with your brother. He says, make amends before you get sued. So that's another legal issue, right? He's saying, okay, you have a legal issue going on. Get beyond the legality of that issue. Go to your adversary and make amends with them. Avoid getting sued. Don't even let it become a legal matter. Maybe it was a legal matter that started it out, but don't make it be something that has to go to court and be tried according to the law. He's saying, no, there's a higher and better way, and that is to avoid following the letter of the law, because you're really going to suffer. He says you're going to go to court, you're going to get penalties, you're going to get punished. All these things are going to happen when you could instead, through relationship, go to your brother or go to your adversary, as he says in this point, and make it right. So again, it's heart before legality. Again, when he talks about the adultery versus lust, he's saying, okay, so we have all these ideas that how the commandments in the laws say, oh, you shouldn't covet your neighbor's wife, you shouldn't lust, you shouldn't do lewd acts, you shouldn't be involved in all of these things. And what was happening was, and this still happens, it still happens today, because the church is filled with legalist ideas. And so people say, oh, well, as long as I don't go and commit fornication or adultery, then I'm living according to the letter of the law, and I'm fine. Or as long as I don't go and do some sexually lewd act with someone, then I'm fine, because according to the letter of the law, I'm fine. And Jesus is saying, wait a minute, if you are lusting after that woman, if you are purposefully looking at that woman because you want to lust after her, you want to let your thoughts wander, you're already committing the same type of sin in your heart. Why? Because sin is a heart issue, not a legal issue. The law merely points the way to how the Creator wants us to live. It's a heart issue. That's what he's saying here. He talks about legal divorce versus relational justice. He says, okay, so you have the law. Moses gave you the law that allows for a certain amount of divorce in certain cases. He says, but guess what? If you put your wife away, if you divorce your wife, you're causing her to go marry some other man. And that man that marries her, they are both now involved in a relationship that is not with her original spouse. That's not just. That is not right. The law says, okay, under these conditions, divorce is allowed. Jesus is saying, what is the right thing to do. He brings up the rule, an eye for an eye. Again, a legal matter. And he says, no, rather than requiring an eye for an eye, instead, we should turn the cheek. Someone strikes us on one side, we turn the other cheek and allow them to strike us there as well. We show mercy. We show love. We become peacemakers. That is the heart of the Creator. So then at the end of chapter 5, he says this, be ye perfect, even as your Father, which is in heaven, is perfect. That is the point. Now, the Sermon on the Mount continues for 2 more chapters in the book of Matthew. So it's quite a lengthy sermon, and there's a lot more that Jesus said. But if you read it, you'll discover that the entire message is following the same lines. Jesus is saying, this is all about your heart. It's all about how you are going to serve your Creator. It's not about, sorry, the light in this car is really funky. He's saying it's not about just following the law, but rather it is actually about your heart. So as Christians, we like to take these things and make them into other rules. And we say, oh, well, see, if you lust after a woman, you're committing adultery. That's a rule. Or if you're angry at a brother and you hate a brother, then you're committing the same sin as murder. And that's a rule. So we have all these laws that we make up. And that's what they are. We create new laws for ourselves. We take these teachings of Jesus and we think that they are rules that we have to follow, when what he's saying to us is the same thing he was saying to the children of Israel. He was saying, stop following laws and follow your God. Follow your God. Learn his heart and follow him. And that's what Jesus was saying.